In this lesson, we're going to talk about nth roots. Nth roots are the same as saying if I want to take a number to the nth power, I would take the nth root to find that number. So let's look at some examples. I have this chart below. I have x cubed equals 64. So that's the same as saying 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. So 4 is the cubic root of 64. Another way we could write this is the cube root of 64 would be 4. Another one we can look at is x to the fourth equals 625. So we want to figure out what x would be to the fourth to give us that 625. So that's the same as taking 5 times 5 times 5 times 5, which would give us 625. So 5 is the fourth root of 625. That also can be written as the fourth root of 625 would give us 5. So, similarly, x to the fifth equals 32. We want to figure out what x would be to the fifth that would give us 32. So if we take 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is 32. 2 is the fifth root of 32. So we can write that as the fifth root of 32. Or that would be 2. So now if we want to write a general formula, we could say that any number a to the nth root would give us b. Or a times a times a n times would give us b. So a is the nth root of b. Another way of saying that is the nth root of b is a. Here we have the square root of 25. Well, we all know the square root of 25 is just 5. Now, if we have a square root of negative 25, the negative is on the outside, this would be the same as taking the square root of 25, which is 5, and then adding that negative sign. Notice this is different than the square root of negative 25. When the negative is on the inside, that's when we have the imaginary numbers. So that would become our 5i, which we're not talking about that in this lesson. So now if we look at plus or minus the square root of 25, again, we would simply just have plus or minus the square root of 25, which is 5. So these are the three forms our answers will be in this first section. We are asked to simplify the following radical, plus or minus the square root of 36 x to the 10th. So the first thing we want to do is break this up. So I want to break this up into the square root of 36 and the square root of x to the 10th. Now, to do this, remember our answer needs to have that plus or minus in front of it. So we're going to have plus or minus. The square root of 36 is 6. And now, the square root of x to the 10th. To find this, we simply take whatever number is out front here, which in this case, since it's a square root, there's a 2 out in front. We take 10 divided by 2, and that gives us what x we would have. So 10 divided by 2 is 5, so our answer would be x to the 5th. Now, if we looked and we saw x to the 6th, the square root of that, again, we could simplify that as 6 divided by 2, since it's the square root, and we would have x to the 3rd. This works for every single problem with variables. So in this, back to our example, our answer would be plus or minus 6x to the 5th. Looking at the next example, we have plus or minus the fourth root of 16 times x minus 3 quantity to the 12th. So if we look at this, again, we could split it up and have 16 under the square root and x minus 3 under the square root, or we could simply just solve it. So what is the fourth root of 16? Well, what times what times what times what gives you 16? Or, if you look at it, the fourth root of 16 would be 2. Remember, we need that plus or minus out in front. Next, we need to look at our x minus 3 to the 12th. We need to take the fourth root of that. So, the fourth root of x minus 3 to the 12th, we do the same thing. We would take 12 divided by 4, and we would have left x minus 3. We have that whole quantity. 12 divided by 4 would give me 3. So my answer then would be plus or minus 2 times the quantity of x minus 3 all to the third power. This would be our simplified answer. Looking at our next example, there's a negative sign out in front of it, so I know our answer is going to have a negative sign in it. Looking at this, it's asking us for the square root. Remember, if there's not a number in front, there always is that 2 in front, and it's the square root. So to do this again, we're going to have that whole quantity of y plus 7 raised to the 16th. So to find the square root of that, we simply take 16 divided by what our root is, which in this case is 2. So my answer would be negative the quantity of y plus 7. 16 divided by 2 is 8. So it would be negative y plus 7 to the 8th power. And that's our answer. Looking at one more example. Remember, we have a plus or minus in front of the square root, so our answer is going to have a plus or minus in front of it. Looking at each individual piece, the square root of 36 is 6. We have x to the 4th. Remember, there's a 2 out in front whenever there's a square root. So we would do 4 divided by 2, which would give us x squared. We have y to the 6th, which we have to divide by 2 because it's the square root. So we would have y to the 3rd. And then we have z to the 10th, which if we take the square root of that, divide it by 2, we would be left with z to the 5th. So my final answer would be plus or minus 6x squared, y to the 3rd, z to the 5th. And this is the lesson completely on nth roots.